The wind howled through the pass, masking the sound of the bolt cycling, but it couldn't drown out the static in the earpiece. Do not engage, Sierra 1. I repeat, do not engage. That is a civilian structure. The voice from the JOC, Joint Operations Center, was tinny, detached, safe in an air-conditioned room 4,000 miles away. Negative, Command. I have PID on the target. He's using the children as heat shields, Elara whispered, her eye burning as she stared through the scope. The world was reduced to math. Barometric pressure, spin drift, the erratic beat of her own heart. If he reaches that ridge, Team Echo is dead. All of them. Stand down, Corporal. That is a direct order. If you take that shot and miss, or hit a collateral, you will face a court-martial before your boots touch American soil. Beside her, Master Chief Miller lay bleeding out, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. He gripped her ankle, his eyes wide with a plea he refused to voice. Save them. You have 10 seconds, Vance, Miller wheezed, blood bubbling past his lips. Make the call. Elara's finger hovered over the trigger. The physics were impossible. The ethics were worse. I'm sorry, she whispered. Not to Command, not to Miller, but to the girl she used to be. Click. 72 hours earlier, Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan. The heat at Bagram Airfield was physical, a heavy blanket that smelled of burning trash and JP-8 jet fuel. It distorted the air above the tarmac, creating shimmering pools of mirage that made distant objects dance like ghosts. For a sniper, mirage was information. For everyone else, it was just a headache. Corporal Elara Needle Vance lay prone in the dust of the calibration range, her cheek welded to the stock of a Macmillan TAC-50. She was small, barely 5'4", and the massive anti-materiel rifle looked ridiculous beside her, like a child trying to play a cello. Hey, sweetie, a voice rasped behind her. You sure the recoil on that cannon isn't gonna snap your collarbone? Elara didn't blink. She didn't move. Her world was the circular image inside her scope. She focused on the breathing technique. Inhale, pause, exhale, pause. I'm talking to you, Alice, the voice persisted. It belonged to Operator Breaker Davis, the lead breacher for SEAL Team Echo. He was a mountain of muscle and beard, standing with his arms crossed, flanked by 3 other Tier 1 operators. They weren't wearing helmets. They wore baseball caps and sunglasses, radiating an aura of untouchable arrogance. Leave her be, Breaker, another voice cut in. Master Chief Grave Miller. He sounded tired. Command says she's our long gun for the Hindu Kush op. Let the kid zero her weapon. She's 19, Chief, Breaker scoffed, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. 19. I have boots older than her, and she's supposed to cover our 6. It's a joke. Some diversity quota form got checked at the Pentagon. Elara adjusted the elevation turret. Click, click. The tactile feedback was the only thing that felt real. Range is clear, the range safety officer, RSO, announced over the loudspeaker. Target deck is hot, 1,000 meters, steel plate. The SEAL sniper, a lanky man named Tex, stepped up to his SR-25. He lay down on the mat next to Elara. Don't worry, darling. I'll handle the heavy lifting. Just try not to flag us with that barrel. Tex fired. Crack. A second later, a puff of dirt kicked up 5 feet to the left of the target. Wind's weird up here, Tex grumbled, adjusting his scope. Kestrel says 5 mph east, but it's pushing hard. He fired again. Another miss, this time right. Variable gusts, Miller noted, frowning. It's the heat thermals coming off the runway. Tricky. Elara watched the mirage. She didn't look at the flags. She didn't look at a Kestrel weather meter. She looked at the way the heat waves boiled through the scope. The boil wasn't moving left or right. It was lifting. A vertical updraft caused by the valley floor heating up. "Hey, Vance," Breaker laughed. "Why don't you pack it up? Tex will dial it in eventually. Save the taxpayer the ammo cost." Elara ignored him. She closed her eyes for a split second, visualizing the bullet's flight path. The updraft would push the round high. The crosswind was a lie. It was a localized eddy. She opened her eyes. Exhale. Pause. The trigger brake was crisp, like snapping a glass rod. Boom! The recoil of the .50 caliber slammed into her shoulder, a violent shove that she absorbed with practiced biomechanics. The concussive wave kicked up a cloud of dust around her, momentarily blinding the SEALs standing behind. Clang. The sound of the bullet striking the steel plate at 1,000 meters drifted back a full 3 seconds later. It was faint, but unmistakable. "Lucky shot," Tex muttered. Elara didn't speak. She worked the bolt, ejecting the brass casing. She settled back in. Boom! Clang. "2," Miller counted, his arms uncrossing. Boom! Clang. "3," Miller said, his voice dropping an octave. "Center mass. Every time." Elara engaged the safety and pushed herself up from the dust. She didn't smile. She didn't look for approval. She grabbed her dope book and began logging the atmospheric data. Temp 98F, baro 25.4, updraft 2 MOA. She stood up, brushing the grit from her uniform. The SEAL team was silent. Tex was staring at his kestrel, looking confused. Breaker looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. "The wind isn't pushing east," Elara said softly, her voice flat. She looked directly at Tex, then at Miller. "It's a thermal updraft. If you dial windage, you'll miss every time. You need to hold under." She slung the 20-pound rifle over her shoulder, as if it were a backpack. "Corporal Vance," Miller said, stepping into her path. The mockery was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating assessment. "Where did you learn to read trace like that?" "Appalachia, Master Chief," Elara replied, adjusting her cap. "Hunting groundhogs across the valley. They're smaller than insurgents, and they don't shoot back." She walked past them toward the barracks. She could feel their eyes on her back, no longer scoffing, but heavy with a different kind of weight. Doubt had been replaced by something more dangerous: expectation. They expected a miracle now, and in the mountains where they were going, miracles were in short supply. The easy part was over. The shooting was just math. The war, she knew, would be entirely different. The inside of an MH-47G Chinook does not smell like courage. It smells of hydraulic fluid, stale sweat, and the acrid exhaust that seeps in through the open ramp. It is a vibrating metal coffin designed to vomit violence onto the earth. Corporal Elara Vance sat near the tail, her knees pulled tight to her chest. The massive twin rotors overhead churned the air with a rhythmic thump, thump, thump that vibrated in her teeth. The noise was absolute, erasing the world outside the fuselage. Around her, the men of Team Echo were statues of modern war. Dressed in multicam, their faces were obscured by ballistic mandibles and the four-tubed spider eyes of their GPN VJU-18 night vision goggles. They checked their weapons with fluid, muscular distinctness. Breaker was taping a chemlight to his shoulder. Tex was rechecking the seating of his magazines. They were a single organism, breathing in sync. Elara was the foreign body. "Vance," Master Chief Miller's voice crackled over the ICS intercommunication system, cutting through the rotor noise. "When the ramp drops, you are last out. You stay on my 6. Do not deviate, do not hunt. You are luggage until I say otherwise. Copy? Elara pressed the push-to-talk on her chest. Solid copy, Chief. She felt the heat rise in her neck. Luggage. She gripped the handguard of her Teague-50. The rifle was too long for the cramped cabin, forcing her to sit awkwardly to keep the muzzle pointed at the floor. Miller was protecting her, or perhaps protecting his team from her inexperience. But by putting her in the rear, he was blinding the only person in the squad trained to see what machines missed. The crew chief, a gunner manning the M134 minigun on the starboard window, held up 2 fingers. 2 minutes. The Chinook banked hard, the G-force pressing Elara into the nylon webbing of her seat. They were flying nap of the earth, contour chasing just 50 feet above the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush to stay under the radar. Elara reached up and flipped her NVGs down. The interior of the helicopter exploded into a crisp, bluish-white phosphor image. She looked past the legs of the operators toward the open ramp at the back. The world outside was a blur of streaming gray rock and black voids. LZ coming up, the pilot announced. Sensors reading cold. No heat signatures. We are green for insertion. Copy. Maintain profile, Miller replied. Elara unbuckled her safety belt, timing it with the others. She shuffled toward the rear ramp, trying to get a view of the ground rushing up to meet them. The team was stacking up, blocking her view. She shifted her weight, peering through the small gap between Breaker's shoulder and the fuselage wall. The ground below was a monochromatic wash of white and gray. The LZ was a flat plateau overlooking the valley. It looked empty. But Elara blinked. Her eyes, hypersensitive to contrast even through the tubes, caught a faint variation in the soil temperature. It wasn't a body. Bodies glowed bright white. This was subtle. A patch of ground about 10 meters from the center of the LZ was slightly darker than the surrounding rock. Disturbed earth. When soil is turned over, it loses heat faster than the packed dirt around it. Pilot, hold! Elara shouted into the comms, her voice cracking with the strain of the G-force. The channel went dead silent for a microsecond. Who is that? The pilot snapped. Rear element, Elara said, speaking fast, forcing the words out before Miller could cut her off. I have a soil anomaly at 3 o'clock, 10 meters from the landing spot. Possible IED emplacement. It's disturbed earth, not natural erosion. I'm reading nothing on thermal, rear element, the pilot argued, annoyance bleeding into his tone. We are 30 seconds from wheels down. It's there, Elara insisted. Her heart rate, usually so slow, hammered against her ribs. If she was wrong, she was the hysterical teenage girl who delayed a Tier 1 op. If she was right. Shift the LZ 50 meters north. Do it. Belay that, Miller started. Shift it, Elara screamed, breaking protocol. The helicopter lurched violently as the pilot instinctively reacted to the urgency in her voice. The massive beast flared, banking hard to the left, sliding through the air away from the intended spot. The sudden movement threw the seals off balance. Breaker slammed into the bulkhead. The wheels touched down on the rocky scree 50 meters north of the original mark. Ramp down! Go, go, go! The crew chief roared. The SEALs surged forward, adrenaline overriding their confusion. They sprinted out into the swirling dust cloud, weapons raised, fanning out into a perimeter. Elara scrambled after them, her heavy rifle banging against her thighs. She hit the dirt next to Miller, scanning the darkness. The Chinook roared, lifting off immediately, blasting them with a hurricane of grit before vanishing into the night sky. Silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. Miller crawled over to her, grabbing her shoulder strap and yanking her close. His face was inches from hers, his NVG lenses glowing like demonic eyes. "You better have a damn good reason for overriding a flight warrant officer, Corporal," he hissed. "You almost compromised the bird." "Watch the 3 o'clock," Elara whispered, pointing back toward the original landing spot. Miller looked. Nothing happened. The dust settled. "There's nothing that—" Flash. It wasn't an explosion. It was a single, solitary trip flare. The rotor wash of the departing Chinook had been just strong enough to disturb a tension wire. But because they had shifted north, the main pressure plate hadn't been triggered. The flare sputtered, casting a long, dancing shadow over a mound of dirt. A mound large enough to hide a 150 mm artillery shell wired as a mine. If they had landed there, the heat of the engines would have triggered the primary charge. The Chinook and everyone inside would have been vaporized. The flare died out. Darkness returned. Miller stared at the spot. He didn't say a word. He looked back at Elara. Under the green glow of the night vision, she couldn't see his eyes, but she saw the way his grip on his rifle tightened until his knuckles turned white. "We're being watched!" Breaker's voice came over the team radio, low and tight. "That was a command-detonated setup. They knew we were coming." Elara scanned the ridgeline, 200 meters above them. The air was thin, cold, and smelled of dry sage. She adjusted the focus on her monocular. There, a single glint. Not a light, but a reflection of starlight on glass. It lasted for a fraction of a second, then vanished. Someone up there had just closed a lens cover. "They're waiting for us," Elara said, her voice steady now. The fear of speaking up was gone, replaced by the icy clarity of the hunt. "Move out," Miller ordered, his voice devoid of the earlier condescension. "Vance, you take the second position, right behind point. Keep your eyes open." She wasn't luggage anymore. She was the warning system, and the warning light was flashing red. The Hindu Kush didn't care about elite training. It didn't care about budget, technology, or the trident pinned to a chest back home. The mountains were a physical absolute, a vertical wall of granite and thin air that demanded a toll for every step. 2 hours into the patrol, the adrenaline from the near miss at the LZ had burned off, leaving behind the cold, grinding reality of the movement. They were navigating the green zone, a misnomer in the moonlight. It was a strip of agricultural land, hugging the dried-up riverbed, a tangle of irrigation ditches, waist-high walls, and scrub brush that offered 1,000 places to die. Elara was suffering. The Macmillan TAC-50 was not designed for patrolling. It was a static defense weapon, a 26-pound anchor of steel and fiberglass. With her day pack, ammunition, and ceramic plates, she was carrying nearly half her body weight. Her lungs burned in the thin atmosphere, starved for oxygen at 8,000 feet. But while the SEALs were built for explosive violence, fast-twitch muscle fibers designed for door-kicking, Elara was built for endurance. She was Appalachian tough, raised on ridgelines where you walked 6 miles just to check a fence line. She kept pace, her breath hissing rhythmically through her nose, her eyes never stopping their scan. "Pick it up, rear," Breaker whispered over the comms. He was 50 meters ahead, moving like a shadow. "Maintain interval," Miller corrected, his voice tight. "Vance, what are you seeing?" "Too many angles," Elara murmured, panning her thermal monocular across the canyon walls towering above them. The sheer cliffs were a sniper's paradise. "This is a funnel. If they engage us here, we have no cover." "We're ghosting, Vance." "They don't know we're here," Breaker said, though his confidence sounded thinner than before. Elara paused. She dropped to one knee, the sudden halt causing the operator behind her to bump into her boot. She ignored him. She focused on a cluster of rocks about 600 meters up the north face. To the untrained eye, it was just scree, loose rock debris. But the pattern was wrong. Nature is random, chaos has no geometry. But near the base of a jagged outcropping, the shadows formed a straight line. A slit. "Halt," Elara whispered. "Visual on possible hide. North face. Elevation 600. The column froze instantly. 12 operators melted into the brush, weapons snapping up toward the ridgeline. Miller crawled up beside her. "Talk to me." "Sector 4, Elara said, pointing with a gloved hand. "Just below the shelf. The rock pile is artificial. It's a loophole. Someone built a nest up there." Miller pulled out his own spotting scope, switching to thermal. He stared at the spot for a long 30 seconds. The wind whistled through the valley, rattling the dry corn stalks near the river. "I've got nothing on thermal," Miller said, lowering the optic. "Cold rock? If someone was in there, we'd see a heat bloom from body warmth or breath." "They could be using a thermal blanket," Elara argued, her voice rising slightly. "Or they're deep inside a cave system. Chief, that is a prepared fighting position. It faces directly down into this choke point." Miller checked his wrist Garmin. "We are 20 minutes behind timeline. If we don't hit the compound before Zoro 400, we lose the element of surprise. We can't clear every suspicious shadow in these mountains." "It's not a shadow," Elara insisted. The intuition that had saved them at the LZ was screaming at her again. "If we walk past it, they'll have our backs." Miller looked at her, then up at the dark cliffs. The conflict in his eyes was visible even under the NVGs. He was weighing the mission against the risk. He was the hammer, and she was trying to tell him not to strike. "Breaker," Miller radioed. "Scan the ridge." "Clear, boss," Breaker replied instantly. "Let's move. We're sitting ducks out here." Miller turned to Elara. "We push. Keep an eye on it. But we are not stopping. That's an order." Elara swallowed the protest rising in her throat. "Copy." They moved out. Elara walked with her body turned slightly sideways, her rifle awkward in her hands, keeping her eyes fixed on that dark slit in the rocks. It felt like walking past an open door in a bad neighborhood. She waited for the muzzle flash. She waited for the crack that would end her life. It didn't come. 30 minutes later, the silhouette of the village emerged from the darkness. It was a cluster of mud brick compounds surrounded by high walls, nestled against the base of the mountain. It looked medieval, silent, and imposing. "Stack up," Miller ordered. The team transitioned into CQB mode. Movements became fluid and silent. They approached the main gate of the target compound, the warlord's safe house. Breaker placed a kinetic charge on the lock. Thump. A muffled explosion breached the gate. "Go! Go!" The SEALs flooded into the courtyard, lasers sweeping every corner. "Clear left! Clear right! Room 1, clear!" Elara entered last, holding the perimeter. She expected shouting, gunfire, the chaos of a raid. Instead, there was only the sound of boots on packed dirt. "Building is clear," Breaker announced, his voice confused. "It's empty. No HVT, no guards, nothing." Miller walked into the center of the main room. It was a simple living space. Rugs on the floor, cushions scattered. "Intel was solid," Miller growled, kicking a cushion. "He was supposed to be here." Elara walked past him into the small kitchenette area. The air smelled of cardamom and wet wool. She felt a strange heat emanating from the low table in the corner. She reached out and hovered her hand over a silver tea kettle sitting on a small tray. It was hot. Not warm. Hot. She poured a tiny amount onto the floor. Steam rose up, swirling in the cold air. "Chief," Elara said, her voice barely a whisper. Miller turned and saw the steam. He froze. "They didn't just leave," Elara said, looking around the room, feeling the eyes she couldn't see. "They left 5 minutes ago, when we stopped to look at the ridge." It was a spotter, Miller realized, the color draining from his face. "The hide you saw. They radioed ahead." "We're not the hunters," Elara said, gripping her rifle as the hair on the back of her neck stood up. "We're the bait." Whoosh. The sound was unmistakable. It was the sound of air being displaced by a rocket-propelled grenade. "Incoming!" Breaker screamed. The world turned white. The explosion did not sound like a movie effect. It was not a boom. It was a physical slap. A violent displacement of air that punched the breath out of Elara's lungs before her brain could register the noise. The RPG impact on the compound wall showered the courtyard in a hail of razor-sharp shale and burning debris. Elara was thrown backward, her body skidding across the hard-packed dirt. Her ears rang with a high-pitched squeal that drowned out all other sound. For 3 seconds, she was blind. Dust, thick and choking, filled the air like a solid curtain. Then, the sound returned. It wasn't the heroic shouting of orders, it was the terrifying rhythmic chug-chug-chug of heavy machine guns echoing off the canyon walls. PKM fire, high caliber. "Contact front! Elevation!" The scream came from everywhere and nowhere. The SEALs, trained to react to contact with immediate aggression, were pouring fire toward the ridgeline. Their suppressed rifles sounded like staple guns against the roaring thunder of the enemy's unsuppressed weaponry. Elara scrambled to her knees, coughing up grit. She was in the kill box, a pre-registered target zone, where the enemy had calculated the exact range and angles. The courtyard was a bowl, and the shooters on the cliffs were looking right down into it. Green tracers slashed through the dust, hammering the ground around them. The dirt erupted in angry geysers. "Get inside! Get to hard cover!" Miller's voice cut through the chaos, raw and desperate. Elara grabbed her TAC-50, dragging the heavy case. She tried to move toward the main building where the team was funneling, but the doorway was a fatal funnel. Rounds were chewing up the doorframe, pinning them down. "Man down! Breaker is down!" Through the swirling dust, Elara saw the massive shape of Breaker Davis collapse. His leg was a ruin of shredded fabric and blood. 2 operators grabbed his drag handle, hauling him backward into the structure, while a third laid down a wall of suppressive fire with a MK-48 machine gun. Elara stood up to follow, but a line of machine gun fire stitched across the ground in front of her, cutting her off. The impacts were so close she felt the heat of the rounds. She couldn't go forward. The door was the focal point of the enemy's rage. "Vance, move!" Miller screamed from the darkness of the doorway. She looked at him, then at the tracers tearing up the threshold. If she tried to cross that 5-meter gap, she would be cut in half. "I can't!" she yelled back, though she doubted he could hear her. Another RPG shrieked down from the cliffs. It impacted the roof of the main building, collapsing part of the overhang. The shockwave knocked Elara sideways, rolling her toward the outer perimeter wall. She didn't fight the momentum. She rolled with it, tumbling into the shadows of a small animal pen attached to the outer wall. It was a low structure, roofed with corrugated tin and heaped with dry straw. She lay flat, pressing her face into the dirt. The smell of ammonia and goat dung filled her nose, overpowering the cordite. Inside the main building, the SEALs were trapped. She could hear them shouting, calling for a medic, calling for air support. But outside, in the courtyard, the enemy fire was relentless. They were suppressing the building to keep the Americans pinned, while maneuver elements moved in to finish them off. Elara checked herself. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline dumping into her system. She forced herself to breathe. Inhale, pause, exhale. Her heart rate slowed. The ringing in her ears faded to a dull hum. She was alone, separated from the team. The only thing between her and 50 enemy fighters was a mud brick wall and the darkness. She pulled her rifle close, checking the optic. The lens was dusty but intact. "Command, this is Echo Actual," Miller's voice crackled in her earpiece. "We are pinned, taking heavy fire from high ground. We have one urgent surgical, requesting immediate KAS, close air support." "Echo Actual, this is Havoc," the response came back, frustratingly calm. "Negative on CAS. We have no assets on station for 20 mics. You are on your own." 20 minutes? Miller cursed. "We'll be dead in 10. Elara shifted her position. Through a gap in the rotting wood of the animal pen, she looked up at the cliffs. The enemy thought they had won. They thought the Americans were all huddled in the main building, waiting to die. They didn't know one was outside. High up on the ridge, she saw it again. The thermal signature she had spotted earlier. But now, there were more. Heat blooms popping up along the crest line. They were comfortable. They were standing up, firing down with impunity, thinking they were untouchable at this distance. They were 1,200 meters away, too far for the SEALs' carbines to be effective. The angle was too steep. The math was too hard. Elara extended the bipod legs of her rifle. She pushed the muzzle through the gap in the wood. The physics of the shot flooded her mind. Angle of inclination, 35 degrees. Coriolis effect, spin drift. The bullet would drop, but because she was shooting up at a steep angle, gravity would have less effect on the trajectory. She had to aim low. She wasn't a soldier in that moment. She wasn't a girl. She was a biological computer processing a firing solution. "Echo Actual," she whispered, pressing the comms button. "This is Vance. I'm outside." "Vance? Where the hell are you?" Miller sounded relieved and furious. "I'm in the sheep pen on the east wall," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I have an angle on the ridge." "Vance, get back in here! You're exposed!" "If I move, I die," she said simply. "And if I don't start shooting, you die." She settled the crosshairs on the brightest heat signature on the cliff. It was a PKM gunner, raining death onto the roof where Miller and the others were cowering. "I'm engaging," she said. She didn't wait for permission. The rule of engagement was self-defense. This was defense of the highest order. She exhaled. The world stopped. Crack. The recoil pushed her back into the straw. The report of the .50 caliber was thunderous, drawing attention to her position instantly. But not 200 meters away, the physics of violence arrived before the sound. The PKM gunner simply ceased to exist. The heat signature vanished from her thermal view, replaced by a spray of cooling matter. The machine gun fell silent. For a second, the battlefield held its breath. The enemy on the ridge hadn't expected a counterpunch of that magnitude. Then, the fire shifted. The tracers that had been hammering the main building swung toward the sheep pen. Elara racked the bolt. She wasn't safe. She wasn't hidden. She was the only target that mattered. "One down," she whispered to herself. 49 to go. The sheep pen disintegrated around her. Elara's single shot had been a declaration of war, and the response was absolute. Bullets shredded the corrugated tin roof, turning the sunlight pouring through the holes into dancing beams of dust and lead. She curled into a fetal position, pressing her body into the depression of the earth she had dug out with her boots. "Vance! Status!" Miller's voice was a jagged tear in the static of her earpiece. "Still here," she coughed, her mouth tasting of dry straw and fear. "Taking effective fire." "Displace! You need to displace!" "Negative," she whispered. "If I stand up, I'm dead." The suppressive fire from the ridge was heavy, but it was undisciplined. It was the spray and pray of adrenaline-fueled insurgents. Elara knew the rhythm of panic fire. It was erratic. But then, a new sound cut through the cacophony. Thump. It wasn't the sharp crack of the AK-47s or the rapid chatter of the PKMs. It was a heavy, dull thud, felt in the chest more than heard. A split second later, there was a sickening crunch from the main building where the SEALs were trapped. Thump. Crunch. Elara shifted, risking a glance through a knothole in the wooden slats of the pen. She looked at the main building, 20 meters away. The thick mud brick wall, centuries old and hard as concrete, was exploding, outward. "We're taking rounds inside," Miller shouted over the comms, panic finally edging into his command voice. "They're punching through the north wall. Doc, get Breaker into the back room. Move!" Elara stared at the wall. The holes were neat, perfectly spaced. This wasn't random fire. Someone was methodically dismantling the team's cover, punching holes through 18 inches of dried mud to kill the men hiding behind it. Thump. A scream echoed from inside the building. "Hit! Texas hit! Through the damn wall!" Elara's mind raced. To punch through that much material and still retain lethality, the shooter had to be using a heavy caliber, likely a .338 Lapua or a .50 BMG armor-piercing round. And he wasn't guessing. He knew exactly where they were huddled. "Chief," Elara said, her voice dropping to that eerie calm that always descended on her when the math took over. "It's a sniper. He's wallbanging you." "I know that," Miller snapped. "Where is he?" "I'm looking." Elara slithered forward, pushing the muzzle of her TAC-50 through the debris. She ignored the tracers snapping over her head. She had to find the ghost. She brought her eye to the scope, switching the thermal palette to black hot. The ridge lit up with the white-hot glows of the insurgents firing their AKs. They were easy to see, glowing blobs of heat, moving, shouting, expending energy. But a sniper doesn't glow. A sniper is a void. She scanned slowly, fighting the urge to rush. Left to right. Near to far. The insurgents were clustered on the lower shelf, about 800 meters up, but the heavy shots were coming from higher. Much higher. She pushed the magnification to 25x. The image jittered with the vibration of the mortars impacting the courtyard. She forced her breathing to stabilize the reticle. There. High on the crest, near a jagged spine of granite, there was nothing. No heat signature. No movement. But the air was wrong. Through the high-end optics, she saw a faint distortion. It wasn't the heat of a body. It was the heat of gas. A suppressor traps the exploding gas of a gunshot, but it gets hot, very hot. After 3 shots, a suppressor is a beacon on thermal imaging, unless you wrap it. This shooter had wrapped his barrel, but he couldn't hide the mirage. Every time the heavy thump echoed, a tiny, almost invisible ripple of heat waved in front of a dark fissure in the rocks. "I see him," Elara whispered. "Call it," Miller demanded. Elevation 1200. Reference the Twin Peaks. Drop down 50 meters. There's a vertical fissure in the rock face. Deep shadow. Can you take the shot? Elara adjusted her turret. She ranged it with the reticle. 1,250 meters. Angle of fire. 40 degrees incline. She had the distance. She had the wind hold. She shifted her position to line up the bore. But as she centered the crosshairs on the fissure, she stopped. The fissure was narrow. The enemy sniper wasn't sitting out in the open. He was deep inside a cave or a crevice, shooting through a loophole, a small opening just big enough for his barrel. From her position in the sheep pen, she was looking up at him from a shallow angle. She couldn't see into the hole. She could only see the rock face around it. "Negative," she said, the realization hitting her like a stone. "I have no angle. He's keyholed deep in the rock. I can't hit him from the valley floor." Thump. "Damn it," Miller cursed. "He just took out our radio. Vance, if you don't kill him, he is going to pick us apart until there is nothing left to bury." Elara pulled her eye away from the scope. She looked at the sheer cliff face to her right. It rose up, jagged and exposed, leading to a precarious shelf about 300 meters above the valley floor. If she stayed here, she was safe. The sheep pen was low priority for the sniper. He wanted the seals. If she climbed, she would be exposed to every gun on the mountain. But from that shelf, the angle would change. She would be able to look into the fissure. "I have to move," she said to herself. "Say again?" Miller asked. "I can't take the shot from here," Elara said, retracting her bipod legs with a metallic click. "I need elevation. I'm going up." "Vance, do not leave cover. The courtyard is a kill zone." "You're already dead if I stay here, Chief." She didn't wait for his permission. She grabbed her rifle, checked the magazine, and took a breath that tasted of dust and destiny. She looked at the open ground between the sheep pen and the base of the cliff. 50 meters of open death. She tightened her bootlaces. "Cover me," she whispered. She burst from the straw, sprinting not like a soldier, but like a deer, fast, low, and desperate. The mountain erupted. The 50 meters between the sheep pen and the cliff face were the longest seconds of Elara's life. The dirt erupted around her boots as she ran, a chaotic spray of geysers kicked up by the AK-47 fire raining down from the high ground. She didn't look up. She didn't look back. She fixed her eyes on a dark fissure at the base of the granite wall and threw herself into it. She hit the rock hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She scrambled into the narrow crevice, pressing her back against the cold stone, gasping for air. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Vance!" Miller's voice was frantic in her ear. "Report!" "At the base," she wheezed, checking her rifle. The scope covers were still on. "Good." Starting the ascent. "Vance, you're skylining yourself," Miller warned. "If they see movement on that wall, then keep them busy," she snapped, cutting the channel. She looked up. The cliff wasn't a clean climbing wall. It was a jagged, fractured mess of shale and limestone, rising steeply toward a narrow shelf about 80 meters above. It wasn't the summit, but it was high enough to change the geometry of the battlefield. From up there, she could look down into the enemy sniper's loophole. She tightened the sling of the TAC-50, shifting the 26-pound rifle so it sat diagonally across her back. It was a clumsy, heavy burden that threatened to pull her off balance with every move. She reached up, finding a handhold. The rock was sharp, biting into her gloves. She pulled. The climb was a brutal exercise in physics and pain. Every time she lifted her weight, the rifle dug into her spine. The terrain was Class 4, steep enough to require hands, but not vertical enough for ropes. But with the weight of her armor, ammo, and weapon, it felt like free solo climbing. 10 meters, 20. Below her, the battle raged. The sound of gunfire was different up here, detached, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder rolling in a jar. She could see the tracers crossing in the courtyard, a deadly light show. The SEALs were fighting for their lives, trapped in a burning building. Elara focused on the rock in front of her face. 3 points of contact. Hand, hand, foot, move, hand, foot, foot, move. Sweat stung her eyes. Her muscles burned with lactic acid. She was 19 years old, fighting gravity and a mountain range that had broken empires. At 40 meters up, disaster struck. She reached for a protruding slab of gray rock, testing it with her weight. It felt solid. She committed, pulling herself up. Crack. The slab sheared off. Elara's right hand flew back, grasping at empty air. Her body swung violently to the left, the weight of the rifle acting as a pendulum. Her left boot scraped uselessly against the smooth stone. She fell. For a heartbeat, she was airborne, sliding down the rough face of the cliff. Her chest slammed into the rock, knocking the wind out of her again. Her fingers clawed desperately at the shale, tearing her gloves, shredding her fingernails. She slammed to a halt 5 meters down, her boot catching on a stubborn root of a scrub bush growing out of a crack. The dislodged slab tumbled down the cliff face, clattering loudly against the stone before smashing into the scree at the bottom. Clatter, crash, thud. The sound echoed through the valley, louder than a gunshot in the lull of the firefight. Elara froze. She didn't breathe. She didn't blink. She pressed her face into the lichen-covered rock, becoming part of the mountain. Below, the machine gun fire from the ridge shifted. The enemy had heard the rock fall. A line of bullets strafed the cliff face, searching. Dust puffed up 10 feet to her right, then 10 feet to her left. They were reconning by fire, shooting blindly to see if anything moved. If she flinched, if she scrambled, if she even exhaled too hard, they would see the movement. The human eye is drawn to motion. So she died. Not literally, but tactically. She forced her body to go limp, surrendering to the uncomfortable position. Her leg was cramped, twisting at a bad angle. Her shoulder throbbed where she had slammed into the wall. Don't move. 5 minutes passed. The bullets stopped hitting the wall. The enemy grew bored, their attention drawn back to the SEALs in the courtyard, who were now returning fire to draw attention away from her. 10 minutes. Her leg went numb. The cramp was a knot of fire, but she locked it away in a box in her mind. This was the sniper's curse, the ability to endure stillness that would drive a normal person insane. 20 minutes. The shadows on the cliff face lengthened. The sun was dipping behind the peaks, casting the valley into a twilight gloom. This was her ally. Elara finally moved her pinky finger, then her wrist, then her neck. She looked up. The shelf was still 30 meters away. Vance? Miller's voice was a whisper now. You still with us? Moving, she replied, her voice dry as the dust in her throat. She resumed the climb. This time she didn't rush. She moved with the agonizing slowness of a chameleon. Every handhold was tested twice. Every step was silent. She reached the shelf as the last light faded from the sky. It was a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for a prone body, hidden behind a screen of dry sagebrush. She pulled herself over the lip, rolling onto her back to stare at the first stars appearing in the violet sky. Her lungs heaved, sucking in the thin, cold air. She wanted to lie there. She wanted to close her eyes and sleep. But the thump from the valley floor reminded her why she was here. She rolled onto her stomach, dragging the TAC-50 around. She deployed the bipod legs, settling them into the dirt. She cleared the scope covers. She brought the optic to her eye, looking across the valley. The angle had changed. She was no longer looking up at the enemy ridge from below. She was parallel to it, albeit slightly lower. She scanned the dark fissure where the enemy ghost was hiding. From this new angle, the loophole wasn't a black void. She could see into the shadow. She saw the barrel of the heavy rifle resting on a tripod deep inside the cave. She saw the heat signature of the shooter, a glowing red shape hunched over the stock. But then, she saw something else. Behind the shooter, deeper in the cave, was another heat signature, smaller, hunched, holding a pair of binoculars, a spotter. And behind the spotter, stacked against the cave wall, were glowing rectangular shapes. Ammo crates, explosives. Elara realized with a cold jolt of horror that she wasn't just hunting a sniper. She was looking at a fortified munitions cache. "Chief," Elara whispered, her finger taking up the slack on the trigger. "I found him, but he brought friends." The wind gusted, howling over the lip of the cliff, tearing at her clothes. It was a crosswind, full value 20 miles per hour, a nightmare for a ballistic solution. Elara adjusted her dial. She didn't feel the cold anymore. She didn't feel the pain in her hands. She was the needle, and she was about to thread the eye of the storm. The wind was a living thing. It didn't just blow, it hunted. It swirled down the canyon walls, banking off the rock faces, creating invisible rivers of turbulence that could push a bullet 3 feet off course at this distance. Elara lay prone on the cold stone shelf, her body molded into the earth. Through the scope of the TAC-50, the world was green and grainy. The thermal overlay added a layer of predatory clarity. The red heat of the enemy sniper's barrel, the white glow of the spotter's face. She checked her kestrel wind meter, but the numbers flickering on the small screen were useless. The wind where she was lying was blowing right to left at 10 miles per hour. But 800 meters out, near the enemy ridge, the dust was kicking up left to right, across canyon sheer, the nightmare of long-range ballistics. "Target is static," Elara whispered to herself. The enemy shooter was comfortable. He had no idea she was there. He was racking the bolt of his heavy rifle, preparing to put another armor-piercing round through the wall of the farmhouse below. Elara reached up and dialed the elevation turret. Click, click, click. 38 minutes of angle. The physics of the drop were constant. Gravity was reliable. But the wind was a gamble. If she missed, the crack of the .50 caliber would echo like a thunderclap. Every gun on that ridge would turn toward her ledge. She would have no cover, nowhere to run. It was one shot, or suicide. She closed her eyes for a second, feeling the air on her cheek. She listened to the sound of the gale tearing through the sagebrush. It was gusting. High, then low. High, then low. She opened her eyes and focused on the mirage, the heat waves shimmering off the rocks near the target. Even in the cooling night, the rock retained enough heat to create a faint boil. The boil was flattening out. The wind was picking up. Wait. She watched the enemy spotter. He raised his binoculars, scanning the valley floor, looking for the muzzle flashes of the SEALs. He pointed at the farmhouse. The sniper settled in behind his scope. Wait. The wind roared in her ears, then suddenly, inexplicably, it died. The sagebrush stopped dancing. the dust hanging in the air over the valley suspended in a moment of perfect stillness. Now. Elara didn't pull the trigger. She squeezed it, a steady, increasing pressure straight back. Crack. The rifle slammed into her shoulder, the muzzle brake venting burning gas to the sides. The heavy recoil broke her sight picture, the scope jerking upward. She forced the rifle back down instantly, her eye hunting for the impact. At 1,250 meters, the flight time of the bullet was nearly 2 seconds. 2 seconds is a lifetime. It is enough time to regret the shot. It is enough time to pray. Through the scope, she saw the trace, the disturbance in the air caused by the supersonic shockwave of the bullet. It looked like a funnel of distorted air arcing through the sky, dropping toward the dark fissure. The trace disappeared into the shadow. For a microsecond, nothing happened. Then, the heat signature of the enemy sniper simply unraveled. There was no cinematic explosion. The red shape jerked violently backward, as if yanked by an invisible cable. The glowing warmth of his body slumped sideways, disappearing behind the rock wall. Hit. The spotter froze. He stared at the empty space where his partner had been. He didn't understand. There had been no sound yet. The bullet had traveled faster than the noise. Then the sound arrived. Thump. The spotter scrambled backward, dropping his binoculars, diving deeper into the cave. "Target down," Elara said. Her voice was flat, hollow. She waited for the rush, the adrenaline spike, the triumphant surge that the movies promised. But there was nothing. Just the cold stone under her stomach and the ringing in her ears. She had just ended a life from 3/4 of a mile away, and she felt as detached as if she had just filed a tax return. That emptiness scared her more than the return fire. Below, in the valley, the silence was absolute. The rhythmic pounding of the enemy sniper's gun had stopped. "Echo Actual, this is Sierra 1, Elara radioed. "Primary threat neutralized. The wallbanger is dead." There was a pause on the line, a long, static-filled silence. "Say again, Sierra 1? Miller's voice came back. He sounded winded, incredulous. "You got him?" "Affirmative. Center mass. Threat is down." "Vance," Miller breathed. That was over 1,200 meters, in the dark." "Wind died down," she lied. It hadn't died down. She had just lived in the gap. "Good copy," Miller said, his voice hardening, shifting back to tactical mode. "All stations, check fire. We have a lull, reload and reorg. Doc, how's Breaker?" "Stable," the medic's voice replied. "But we need to move him. The dust in here is choking him out." Elara cycled the bolt of her rifle. The massive brass casing spun out, landing on the rock next to her face. It was hot, searing the cold skin of her cheek. She didn't move it. The pain was grounding. It reminded her she was real. "Sierra 1, hold your position," Miller ordered. "Scan for secondaries. If he had a spotter, there might be more." "Copy," Elara said. She shifted her gaze back to the cave. The spotter was gone, but the ammo crates were still there, glowing faintly on the thermal. She had killed the shooter. But the gun was still there. And wars weren't fought by men anymore. They were fought by logistics. "Chief," Elara said, "I see munitions. I see a lot of them. This wasn't a sniper hide. It's a supply dump. Can you destroy it?" Elara looked at her magazine. She had loaded A191 match rounds, solid lead and copper. Great for accuracy, bad for blowing things up. But she had one magazine of MK211 Raufoss, high-explosive incendiary armor-piercing, the do-everything round. She reached for her pouch. "Stand by," she said. "I'm going to light a fire." She dropped the magazine. the metallic click sounding impossibly loud in the returning silence. The wind began to howl again, angry that it had missed its chance to save the man in the cave. Elara settled back in, one down. But the night was just getting started. The silence following the sniper's death was a deception. It was the deep breath before the scream. "Echo 1, we are moving!" Miller's voice crackled. "We're breaking contact. Heading for the wadi on the south side. Keep our heads down, Vance." "Copy, Chief. I have the sector," Elara replied. She watched through the thermal scope as the SEALs spilled out of the battered farmhouse. They moved with aggressive fluidity, dragging the wounded breaker between them. They were dark shapes in a world of gray, sprinting toward the dry riverbed that would offer them cover. But the enemy was not retreating. They were evolving. From the maze of mud brick alleys to the east, heat signatures began to flood the open ground. But these weren't just the sharp, aggressive movements of fighters. These were erratic, stumbling shapes. Small ones, civilians, women in long chadors and children, herded out of their homes, pushed into the street like cattle. They were screaming. Elara couldn't hear it from her perch, but she saw the way their bodies jerked, the way mothers shielded their young. And moving in their wake, using them as a living wall, were the insurgents. "Chief, you have movement east," Elara warned, her finger hovering over the trigger guard. "Multiple contacts, but they're mixed. I repeat, they are mixed with civvies." "How close?" 100 meters and closing. They're pushing the civilians toward your flank." The SEALs reached the edge of the wadi, dropping into the cover of the ditch. But the ditch was a trap if the enemy could get close enough to toss grenades down into it. Elara tracked a group of 3 men moving behind a cluster of women. The men were carrying RPG launchers. They stopped, using the women's flowing robes to mask their weapons. "RPG team setting up," Elara said, her voice tight. "Sector 3, behind the well." "Take them out, Vance," Miller yelled. The sound of AK-47 fire erupted from the wadi as the SEALs engaged the other flank. Elara centered the crosshairs. The magnification was high enough that she could see the heat bloom of a child clinging to the leg of one of the women. The insurgent with the RPG was standing directly behind them, using the woman's shoulder as a rest for the launcher tube. If Elara fired the .50 caliber, the round would pass through the insurgent. But the hydrostatic shock, the pressure wave created by the bullet passing through tissue, was lethal within inches, and if she missed by a fraction— "I can't," Elara whispered. "They're using human shields. I don't have a clean line." "Vance, they are lining up a shot on our position. If that RPG fires, we are done." The physics of the shot were simple. The morality was impossible. Elara watched the insurgent adjust his aim. He was taking his time. He knew the Americans wouldn't shoot. He knew the rules of engagement better than they did. He was weaponizing their morality. Shoot the woman to save the team? Let the team die to save the woman. The dilemma paralyzed her. Her finger, usually so steady, refused to compress the trigger. She was 19. She wasn't God. She didn't have the right to decide who lived and who died in this equation. "Vance, now!" The insurgent pulled the trigger on the RPG. Whoosh! The rocket streaked across the open ground, leaving a trail of gray smoke. It slammed into the lip of the wadi, right where Miller and the medic were crouching. Boom! The explosion threw dirt and rock high into the air. Man down! Man down! Miller is hit!" The radio exploded into chaos. "Chief!" Elara screamed. She saw the heat signature of the Master Chief blown backward, crumpling against the dirt bank. He wasn't moving. The insurgent was reloading. He grabbed another rocket from the pack of the man beside him. The woman and child were still standing there, frozen in terror. Elara's hesitation had a cost. The cost was blood. Something inside her fractured. The detached observer, the girl who looked at the world through a lens, died. In her place, something cold and necessary took over. She shifted her aim. She didn't aim for the insurgent's chest. That was too close to the woman. She aimed for the RPG warhead itself, protruding from the launcher. It was a 1 in a million shot. A coin toss with the devil. "Forgive me," she breathed. She fired. Crack. The bullet crossed the valley in a heartbeat. It struck the warhead of the RPG just as the insurgent was lifting it to his shoulder. The warhead didn't detonate fully. The safety arming distance hadn't been reached. But the kinetic impact of the .50 caliber round shattered the propellant and the explosive charge. The RPG disintegrated in a violent flash of deflagration, a fireball that engulfed the insurgent. The blast knocked the woman and child forward, face first into the dirt. They lay still. Elara didn't know if they were dead. She didn't know if the shrapnel had killed them, or if the shockwave had simply knocked them out. She racked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing. "Threat neutralized," she said, her voice unrecognizable to her own ears. It was dead. Robotic. "Chief is down." The medic's voice came over the net, frantic. "Shrapnel to the neck. Arterial bleed. We need to move now." "Vance." It was Tex, the sniper who had mocked her earlier. His voice was shaking. "Clear us a path. Kill everything that isn't us. Do you copy?" "Everything." Elara looked through the scope. The civilians were scattering. The insurgents were exposed. "Copy," Elara said. She settled the crosshairs on the next target. There was no hesitation this time. The hesitation had almost cost Miller his life. She wouldn't make that mistake again. She began to fire, rhythmically, methodically, boom, rack, boom, rack. She wasn't a guardian angel anymore. She was the reaper. And the harvest had begun. The valley was a bowl of noise, but inside the radio headset, there was a different kind of violence. It was the white noise of isolation. "Havoc! This is Echo 1! Immediate! Immediate!" Tex's voice was cracking with desperation. "We have a Category Alpha casualty, requesting immediate extraction. Havoc, do you copy?" Hiss, pop, squeal. Elara pressed her earpiece deeper into her auditory canal, wincing at the electronic screeching. It wasn't just bad reception caused by the canyon walls. This was rhythmic, a pulsing, jagged static that swept across the frequency spectrum, drowning out the satellite uplink. "They're jamming us," Elara realized, speaking to the empty air of her perch. Down in the wadi, the situation was disintegrating. Through her scope, she could see Doc working frantically on Miller. The Master Chief was a pale shape in the moonlight, his neck packed with combat gauze that was rapidly turning black under the night vision filters. He wasn't moving. "Echo 1, this is Sierra," Elara transmitted on the short-range inter-team channel. The jammer was likely targeting long-range SATCOM frequencies, leaving their low-power line-of-sight radios somewhat functional. "Tex, you're being jammed. You won't get a signal out to Havoc." "I know, damn it," Tex yelled back. He was the senior operator now, but the weight of command sat heavy on him. "If we don't get a bird in the air in 5 minutes, Miller is a corpse. Can you see the source?" Elara shifted her position. Her shoulder ached with a dull, throbbing bruise from the recoil of the last dozen shots. She forced herself to focus. Jamming equipment in this terrain wouldn't be a backpack unit. It needed power. It needed a generator or a vehicle battery. She scanned the far end of the valley, past the village, where the road wound up toward the mountain pass. The thermal image was a cluttered mess of cooling rocks and burning debris. "Looking," she said. She broke the sector down into grids. Grid 1, clear. Grid 2, burning truck. Grid 3, there. Parked behind a low stone wall, about 1,500 meters away, was a Toyota Land Cruiser. It wasn't part of the assault force. It was stationary. And rising from the rear bed was a distinct, vertical line. A whip antenna, thick and tall. But it was the heat signature that gave it away. The base of the antenna was glowing white-hot on the thermal display. Amplifiers generate heat, a lot of it. "I have the emitter," Elara said. "Grid 44 by the North Road. Technical vehicle, high-gain antenna." "Can you kill it?" Tex asked. "It's 1,500 meters," Elara replied. "That's pushing the max effective range of the system." "Vance," Tex said, his voice dropping low, sounding suddenly very young. "He's bleeding out. Please." The word hung in the air. Please. SEALs didn't say please. They gave orders. They made demands. When a SEAL said please, the world had already ended. Elara adjusted her elevation knob. She was nearly out of adjustment range. She would have to hold over the target using the mil dots in her reticle. At this distance, the bullet would take nearly 3 seconds to arrive. It would drop over 40 feet. She wasn't shooting at a man. She was shooting at a piece of electronics the size of a shoebox mounted on a truck bed. "Sending it," she whispered. She didn't wait for the wind. There was no waiting anymore. Miller's life was measured in heartbeats, and he didn't have many left. She exhaled, emptying her lungs until she was a vacuum. Crack. The rifle bucked. Elara held the follow-through, watching the trace arch high into the night sky, a faint disruption in the stars. It crested the apex of its flight and began the long, steep dive toward the target. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Spark. The round impacted the base of the antenna mast. The kinetic energy smashed through the amplifier housing. On the thermal scope, a sudden bright flare of electrical discharge erupted as the capacitors blew. The antenna toppled over, slicing through the air before crashing onto the hood of the truck. The static in her ear vanished instantly. "Havoc, this is Echo 1, radio check," Tex screamed. "Echo 1, this is Havoc, read you 5 by 5. The voice from the JOC was clear as a bell. "Go ahead with your traffic. We have a 9-line. Urgent surgical. Get the birds in the air." Elara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She rested her forehead against the stock of the rifle. He has a chance. But physics demands a trade. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. She had just fired a high-velocity round from a fixed position that had already been compromised. The muzzle flash, even with a suppressor, was visible to anyone looking, and someone was looking. A low whistling sound cut through the cold air. It wasn't the sharp snap of a bullet. It was the soft, terrifying whisper of gravity-fed ordnance. Thump. An explosion erupted on the cliff face, 50 meters below her ledge. Elara jerked her head up. The enemy mortar team had triangulated her position. They weren't guessing anymore. They were walking the rounds in, thump. The second round hit 30 meters to her left, showering her with rock shards. "Sierra 1, you are taking indirect fire," Tex shouted over the net. "Get out of there." "I'm bracketed," Elara yelled, scrambling backward, grabbing the drag handle of her rifle case. She couldn't go down. The cliff was too steep to descend quickly. She couldn't stay. Thump. The third round hit the edge of the shelf, 10 meters away. The The concussive blast lifted Elara off the ground and slammed her into the rock wall. Her vision went white. The sound of the world was replaced by a high-pitched ringing. She tasted copper. She tried to stand, but the ground tilted violently. She was alone on the side of a mountain. The extraction birds were 20 minutes out, and the enemy had just decided that she was the most important target on the battlefield. The fourth round was coming. She could feel it in the air pressure. She didn't wait. She dragged herself into the narrow depression behind a boulder, curling into a ball as the mountain shook again. If the mortars didn't kill her, the fall would. And if the fall didn't kill her, the cold was waiting its turn. The radio chatter faded into a dull buzz. She checked her rifle. The scope was cracked. "Blind," she whispered. "I'm blind." The world was not black and white. It was gray and spinning. Elara tried to push herself up, but the ground lurched violently to the left, slamming her shoulder back into the dirt. She wasn't sure if the earth was actually moving, or if her inner ear had been shredded by the overpressure of the blast. Rhying! The sound was inside her skull, a high-frequency scream that masked the reality of the war outside. She couldn't hear the wind. She couldn't hear the mortars. She could only feel the rhythmic vibration of the ground as the enemy walked the rounds across her position. Thump, vibrate. Thump, vibrate. She tasted copper. She spit, and a glob of dark blood landed on the pale limestone. Biting her tongue, internal bleeding, it didn't matter. Move off the X, the training kicked in, bypassing the confused conscious brain and wiring directly into her muscles. You do not stay where the bombs are falling. She grabbed the drag handle of the TAC-50. It felt impossibly heavy, like it was bolted to the mountain. She pulled, her boots scrabbling for purchase on the loose shale. She slithered backward, away from the exposed shelf, dropping into a narrow drainage chute that cut down the side of the cliff. It was steep, choked with thorns and sharp rocks, but it offered defilade, protection from the direct line of sight of the mortar team. She slid down 10 meters, the fabric of her uniform tearing against the stone, before jamming her boots into a crevice to stop her descent. She huddled there, gasping for air. The exertion made her head pound with a sickening throb. She needed to check her gear. She pulled the rifle across her lap. It was covered in gray dust. She wiped the objective lens of the scope with her thumb. The glass was spider-webbed. A hairline fracture ran diagonally across the main lens. It wasn't shattered, but the seal was broken. Nitrogen gas used to prevent fogging would be leaking out. The reticle, the delicate crosshair etched into the glass, might have shifted. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. "No, no, no." She brought the stock to her shoulder and looked through it. The image was distorted, refracted by the crack. The illuminated center dot was fuzzy. Without this scope, the rifle was just a 26-pound metal club. The enemy was engaging from 800 meters plus. Iron sights were useless at that distance. She was combat ineffective. Ditch it. The thought was seductive. If she dropped the rifle, she would be light. She could move fast. She had her M4 carbine for close defense. She could run down the mountain, link up with the SEALs, and get on the bird. She looked at the rifle. It was scarred, scratched, and now broken. It was an anchor. But then she looked down at the valley floor. The SEALs were still moving toward the extraction. They were exposed. If the enemy mortar team shifted fire to them, or if another sniper appeared, the M4 carbine would do nothing. She was their shield. Even a cracked shield was better than nothing. "I am not leaving you," she gritted out. She pulled out her multi-tool. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably from the concussion. She jammed the screwdriver bit into the scope rings. The impact had twisted the mount slightly. If she didn't realign it, the point of impact would be off by feet, not inches. Thump. A mortar round landed near the shelf she had just vacated. Shrapnel whistled over her head, cutting through the brush like a scythe. She ignored it. She focused on the screw. Turn. Bite. Turn. She torqued the mount back into position, using brute force to align the witness marks she had painted on the metal weeks ago. It wasn't precision gunsmithing. It was battlefield triage. She checked the lens again. The crack was still there, cutting through the lower left quadrant of her view. But the center, the kill box, was relatively clear. Good enough, she lied to herself. She couldn't stay in the chute. The enemy would sweep the cliff once the mortars stopped. She had to move laterally to find a new hide before they sent a patrol up to check for a body. She holstered the multi-tool and swung the heavy rifle onto her back. The strap dug into her bruised shoulder, sending a spike of white-hot pain down her arm. She stifled a cry. "Echo 1, this is Sierra," she rasped into the radio. She couldn't hear if there was static or silence. She just transmitted blindly. "I am displaced. Optic is damaged but functional. I am moving south to flank the mortar team." There was no response. Maybe her radio was broken too, or maybe she was just deaf. She started to crawl. Not climb, crawl. She kept her profile low, moving like a snake through the rocks. Every movement was agony. Her head spun with every turn. Nausea roiled in her stomach. She wasn't fighting the enemy anymore. She was fighting her own body. The desire to just lie down and close her eyes was overwhelming. The rocks were cold. The dark was inviting. "Just rest for a minute," a voice in her head whispered. "You've done enough. You killed the sniper. You saved the chief. Just sleep." Elara bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted fresh blood. The pain sharpened her focus. "Not yet," she hissed. She dragged herself over a ridge of jagged limestone and dropped into a small depression behind a scrub oak. From here, she had a view of the winding road where the mortar team was set up. She saw them. 3 men, a tube, a base plate. They were adjusting the angle, laughing, patting each other on the back. They thought they had killed her. Elara deployed the bipod. She rested her cheek on the stock. The crack in the lens flared in the moonlight, creating a prism effect. She didn't have a ballistic computer. She didn't have a wind meter. She had a broken scope and a brain that was misfiring. She centered the blurry crosshair on the chest of the man dropping the rounds into the tube. "Surprise," she whispered. The mountains of Afghanistan do not retain heat. As soon as the sun drops behind the peaks, the rock bleeds energy into the void, and the temperature plunges 30 degrees in an hour. Elara was freezing. She had neutralized the mortar team. 3 rapid shots through the cracked scope that she prayed would hold 0. But the victory had cost her the element of surprise. The enemy knew she was on the eastern ridge. They knew she was alone. And now, they had sent the wolves. She lay in a shallow depression beneath an overhang of granite, shivering violently. The shivering was dangerous. Movement attracted the eye, and the friction generated heat. Heat was death. Below her, in the valley, she could see the faint glow of flashlights moving systematically up the slopes. A hunter-killer team. They weren't using standard night vision anymore. They were using thermal handhelds. To a thermal sensor, a human body in this freezing environment was a burning beacon of white light against a black background. Elara looked at her hands. They were blue at the fingernails. Her teeth chattered so hard her jaw ached. Mask up, she whispered to herself, the command forcing her brain to override the instinct for comfort. She reached into the icy slurry of mud and snow that had gathered in the crevice of the rock. It was agonizingly cold, like liquid nitrogen. She scooped up a handful and smeared it over her face, then her neck. Then she packed it over the outer layer of her uniform, covering her shoulders and thighs. The cold mud acted as a temporary insulator against the thermal sensors, blending her body temperature with the ambient temperature of the mountain. It was a technique from the survival manuals, one she had practiced in training but never thought she would have to use to keep from being murdered. She pulled her space blanket, a thin sheet of mylar, from her medkit. She didn't wrap herself in it to get warm. She draped it over her body and then covered it with brush and dirt. The mylar would reflect her body heat back inward, preventing it from escaping to be picked up by the enemy's optics. It was a thermal sarcophagus. Inside, she was slowly freezing to death. Outside, she was invisible. Time dissolved. There was no clock, only the rhythm of the wind and the crunch of boots on gravel. Crunch, crunch. Elara stopped breathing. The sound was close. 10 meters, maybe less. She couldn't move her rifle. The barrel was too long, and shifting it would make noise. She slowly, millimetrically, moved her right hand to her belt. Her fingers closed around the cold rubber grip of her issued cowbar knife. Sniper school taught the art of distance. You killed from a mile away. You never saw the eyes. You never smelled the breath. It was clinical, detached, mathematical. This was not math. A shadow fell across the opening of her hide. The enemy scout was young, bearded, wearing a heavy wool coat over his chest rig. He held an AK-74 with a thermal optic mounted on the rail. He swept the weapon back and forth, the lens looking like a robotic eye. He stepped closer. He was looking right at her, but the mud and the mylar were doing their job. To him, she was just another cold rock. He paused, adjusting his sling. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a radio handset, murmuring something in Pashto. He turned his head, exposing the side of his neck. He was 3 feet away. Elara knew that if he walked past, he would spot the outline of her boots from the rear, or he would smell the CLP gun oil on her rifle. She didn't make a decision. Her body made it for her. She exploded from the mud like a demon birthed from the earth. The scout gasped, fumbling to bring his rifle around, but Elara was already inside his guard. She slammed her left forearm into his chest, pinning the weapon against his body, while her right hand drove the knife upward. She didn't slash, she thrust. The blade entered the soft hollow beneath his jaw, seeking the brainstem. It was wet. It was warm. It was horrific. The scout didn't scream. He couldn't. He made a gurgling, wet, choking sound as the air and blood mixed in his ruined throat. His eyes went wide, locking onto hers. In the green glow of the night, she saw the terror, the confusion, the sudden realization of the end. They fell together into the dirt, grappling. He was strong, thrashing with the desperate energy of the dying. His hand clawed at her face, smearing the mud, tearing at her skin. "Die!" she hissed through gritted teeth, twisting the blade. "Just die!" He went limp. The weight of him was heavy, suffocating. Elara pushed him off, rolling away, gasping for air. She scrambled backward, wiping the hot blood from her face. It burned against her frozen skin. She stared at the body. A minute ago, he was a threat. Now he was just meat. She looked at her hands. They were shaking violently, coated in a mixture of freezing mud and steaming crimson. This wasn't the clean, pink mist of a long-range shot. This was intimate. She had felt his life snap. She felt bile rise in her throat. She swallowed it down. There was no time to be sick. She grabbed the scout's radio, she ripped the battery out, and threw it down the ravine. Then she grabbed his thermal optic, stripping it from the rifle. Her own was broken. Maybe she could use this. Sierra 1. Sierra 1. The voice in her earpiece was faint, ghostly. It wasn't the crisp command voice of Master Chief Miller. It was a wet, rattling whisper. Elara keyed her mic, her hand leaving a bloody smear on the plastic. Sierra 1, I'm here. Vance, Miller whispered. The signal was fading. We aren't going to make the secondary extraction. Too many wounded. We're hunkering down in the wadi. Hold on, Chief. Broken Arrow is approved. Birds are coming. Vance, Miller interrupted, his voice thick. Listen to me. If they overrun us, do not come down here. You stay up high. You survive. You tell them we did our job. Don't talk like that. Elara snapped, anger flooding her veins to replace the horror. I am not writing your eulogy, Miller. You keep your head down. You're a hell of a shot, kid, Miller wheezed. Hell of a... The transmission cut to static. Elara sat alone in the dark, the dead man cooling beside her. The cold wasn't just in the air anymore. It was inside her. She picked up her rifle. The scope was cracked. She was freezing. She was covered in blood. But the night wasn't over. And if Miller was going to die, she was going to make sure he wasn't the only one. She looked at the thermal optic she had scavenged. Duct tape. She needed duct tape. She began to work. The duct tape held. It was an ugly, desperate piece of engineering. The enemy's thermal optic strapped to the Picatinny rail of the Macmillan TAC 50 with silver tape and prayer. The alignment was approximate. The eye relief was wrong. But when Elara looked through it, the world was no longer a blur of shadows. It was a crisp, pixelated landscape of grays and whites. She dragged herself back to the edge of the shelf. The cold had moved past pain and settled into a deep, vibrating numbness in her core. Her hands were stiff claws, stained with the dried blood of the man she had killed. Echo 1, status, she croaked. We're pinned. Tex's voice was a ragged shout. They have a heavy weapon moving down the valley floor. We can hear the engine. If that thing crests the rise, we have no cover. Elara scanned the valley floor, 2.5 kilometers away. The distance was astronomical. In the world of sniping, 1,000 meters is a skill. 2,000 meters is luck. 2,400 meters is a myth. But she saw it. A white-hot brick moving through the gray static of the thermal display. A pickup truck bouncing over the rough terrain. Mounted in the bed was a heavy shape, a ZPU-2 anti-aircraft gun, twin barrels. It fired 14.5mm rounds that would punch through the mud walls of the wadi and turn the seals into red mist. I see it, Elara whispered. Range, 2400. She said the number, but her brain refused to process it. The bullet would take nearly 4.5 seconds to get there. In 4 seconds, the truck would move nearly 50 meters. She had to aim at empty space. She had to shoot where the truck would be, not where it was. And she had to account for the rotation of the Earth, the Coriolis effect. At this latitude and firing direction, the Earth would literally spin away from the bullet while it was in the air, causing the shot to hit right. Vance, can you hit it? Tex asked. Stand by. She checked her scope. She was maxed out on elevation. She would have to hold over the target, aiming at a specific star in the sky above the moving truck. The wind was calm here, but down in the valley? Who knew? She tried to do the math. Muzzle velocity, 2,700 FPS, drag coefficient, barometric pressure. The numbers tumbled in her head, crashing into each other. Her concussion made the equations slippery. She couldn't hold the integers. Stop, she told herself. She closed her eyes. She stopped being Corporal Vance. She stopped being 19. She stopped being cold. She became the platform. She opened her eyes. She didn't look at the numbers. She looked at the dust kicking up behind the truck. She looked at the way the pixels shimmered. She moved the rifle. She aimed high above the truck, leading it by a football field length. She aimed at nothing, just darkness. Don't think, she breathed. Just throw it. She exhaled. The pause between heartbeats stretched into infinity. She squeezed. Boom! The recoil was different this time. Because of her awkward angle on the rocks and her frozen muscles, she didn't absorb the kick properly. The buttstock slammed into her shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer. She felt the joint pop. A blinding white flash of agony tore through her arm, stripping the breath from her lungs. Her shoulder was out, dislocated. She screamed, a silent, open-mouthed cry of shock collapsing onto the rifle, but the bullet was gone. It soared through the stratosphere of the valley, a lonely piece of copper and lead spinning at supersonic speeds. It began its long, arcing descent. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. The driver of the technical never heard the shot. He was smoking a cigarette, thinking about the Americans he was about to kill. The round didn't hit him. At that distance, precision on a human target was impossible. The round struck the engine block of the Toyota. The 750-grain AMAX bullet, traveling with the momentum of a freight train, smashed through the grille, punched through the radiator, and cracked the cast-iron engine block in half. The truck seized instantly. The front axle locked up. The vehicle, traveling at 40 miles per hour, cartwheeled forward. It flipped end over end, a chaotic tumble of metal and dust. The gunner in the back was thrown clear, rag-dolling into the rocks. The truck slammed onto its roof, sliding for 50 meters in a shower of sparks before coming to a rest. A secondary explosion, the fuel tank, bloomed on the thermal scope like a sudden sunrise. "Target destroyed!" Elara gasped, clutching her useless, dangling arm. Tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. Target destroyed. Holy! Tex's voice was a whisper over the comms. "Did you see that? God Almighty, did you see that?" Elara couldn't answer. She rolled onto her back, staring up at the indifferent stars. The pain in her shoulder was a living thing, eating her alive. She was broken. Her rifle was broken. But the truck was burning. "Echo 1 to Sierra," Tex said, his voice thick with emotion. "Good effect on target. You just saved our lives, kid. You just saved us all." Elara tried to key the mic, but her fingers wouldn't work. She just lay there listening to the crackle of the fire miles away and the thumping of her own heart, slow and heavy, refusing to stop. Pain was a color. It was a blinding, nauseating white that pulsed behind Elara's eyelids every time her heart beat. Her right arm hung uselessly at her side, the shoulder joint dislocated, the humerus pushed out of the socket. She had jammed it into her belt to immobilize it, but the nerve damage sent electric shocks down to her fingertips with every shallow breath. She lay on her side, peering through the duct-taped thermal optic. The burning wreckage of the technical truck was a bonfire in the distance, but it hadn't stopped them. It had only made them angry. The valley floor was alive. Like a colony of ants disturbed by a boot, dozens of heat signatures were swarming toward the wadi. They were no longer using cover. They were sprinting, firing from the hip, overwhelming the seals with sheer mass. Ammo! I'm black on ammo! A voice screamed over the radio. It wasn't Tex. It was the medic. Fix bayonets! Prepare to repel! Tex roared, his voice cracking. Havoc! Where is that air support? Echo 1, this is Viper 1-1, a new voice cut in. The pilot of an F-16 Fighting Falcon circling somewhere high in the black stratosphere. I am on station. I have eyes on the burning Vic. But I cannot see friendlies. You are all one heat blob. I cannot drop. Repeat, unable to drop. We are being overrun, Tex shouted. Broken arrow! I repeat, broken arrow! Drop everything you have on my coordinates. Broken arrow is the code phrase that no pilot ever wants to hear. It means a ground unit is facing imminent destruction and requests all available ordnance to be deployed, regardless of the risk to their own safety. Copy, broken arrow, the pilot replied, his tone shifting to icy professionalism. But I need a mark. I cannot drop blind on a mixed melee. I need a laser designation or you are all dead. We can't laze, Tex yelled. We're in a ditch. We can't get heads up. Elara spit the blood out of her mouth. She looked at the PEQ-15 laser box mounted on the side of her broken TAC-50. She had one good arm. She had one good eye. That had to be enough. Viper, this is Sierra 1, she croaked. I have the visual. I will laze in. Sierra, confirm you are outside the red risk estimate distance? The pilot asked. Negative, Elara lied. She was well within the fragmentation radius of a 500-pound bomb. I'm clear. Run in from the south. Look for the sparkle. She dragged herself up. To use the laser effectively, she couldn't be prone behind the rock. She had to have a clear line of sight to the center of the enemy mass, which meant she had to expose her head and shoulders above the ridgeline. She pushed the rifle onto the rock with her left hand, gritting her teeth so hard she felt a molar crack. The pain in her right shoulder was apocalyptic. She activated the laser, an infrared beam, invisible to the naked eye but a bright pencil beam to the pilot's sensors, stabbed out into the darkness. She aimed it not at the enemy, but 5 meters in front of the wadi where the SEALs were trapped. I see the sparkle, the pilot announced. 10 seconds, rifle. Down in the valley, the insurgents saw the IR beam too. Many of them had night vision now, stripped from the dead. They saw the line of light tracing back to the cliff face. Sniper! Someone screamed in Pashto. Bullets began to snap around Elara. They hit the rock face, sending stone splinters into her cheeks. A round tugged at her sleeve. She didn't flinch. She couldn't. If she moved the laser, the bomb would drift. If the bomb drifted, Team Echo would be vaporized. Steady, she whispered to the rifle. Steady. She was the anchor. She was the lighthouse in the storm of lead. She focused on the heat signatures swarming the ditch. She could see the SEALs fighting hand-to-hand now, the thermal blooms merging into a chaotic dance of death. 5 seconds, the pilot said. A PKM machine gun found her range. The rounds walked up the cliff, chewing the earth inches from her face. Don't let go. She pressed her cheek into the stock, her left hand locking the rifle in place with a death grip. 3, 2, 1. Weapon away. She didn't hear the jet. The F-16 was flying too high and too fast. But she heard the bomb. It was a tearing sound, like canvas being ripped by a giant's hands. The GBU-38 plunged from the heavens, guiding itself down the invisible wire of light she was holding. Danger close, she whispered. She buried her face in the dirt. Crack, boom. The earth didn't just shake, it convulsed. The shockwave hit the cliff face and rebounded, lifting Elara's body off the ground. The overpressure slammed into her chest, squeezing her heart. A massive cloud of dust and fire erupted from the valley floor, expanding outward in a perfect ring. Debris rained down on the mountain, rocks, metal, dirt. The sound was so loud it was silent. Her ears shut down completely to protect the brain. Elara lay there, covered in dust, her hand still gripping the rifle, the laser still on, pointing at a crater that was now smoking in the moonlight. She waited. The dust began to settle. The screaming had stopped. The gunfire had stopped. The only sound was the ringing in her ears and the distant whine of the jet engines banking away. "Echo 1?" the pilot queried. "Echo 1, status?" Static. Elara stared at the radio. "Please," she whispered, "say something." The thermal scope showed nothing but a massive, glowing hot spot where the bomb had hit. The heat of the explosion masked everything. There were no individual signatures, just a scar on the earth. "Sierra 1 to Echo," Elara tried, her voice breaking. "Tex? Doc? Chief?" Nothing. She had guided a 500-pound bomb onto her own team's position. She had done the math. She had held the laser. If they were dead, she had killed them. She laid her head on the cold rock, the tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. She was 19 years old, and she was the loneliest thing in the universe. Then, a sound. Click, click. A squelch break on the radio. "Havoc!" a voice coughed. It was weak, wet, and barely human. We're still here. Dust is heavy, but we're breathing." Elara let out a sob that sounded like a dying animal. They were alive. "Good copy, Echo," the pilot said, sounding shaken. "That was precise. Whoever was on that laser, buy them a beer." Elara couldn't buy a beer. She wasn't legal drinking age. She tried to push herself up, but her body finally refused. The adrenaline tank was empty. The pain washed over her like a tide. Her vision grayed out at the edges. She keyed the mic one last time. "RTB," she whispered. "Return to base." The radio slipped from her fingers. The darkness took her. Consciousness returned not as a light, but as a sound. It was the rhythmic thumping of rotors beating against the thin mountain air, growing louder, vibrating in the marrow of her bones. Elara opened her eyes. The world was tilted. She was still lying on the rock shelf, half buried in the debris from the mortar strikes. Her right arm was numb, a dead weight strapped to her torso with her own belt. Her head felt like it was filled with broken glass. "Sierra 1, this is Dustoff. Inbound, ETA 2 mics. Pop smoke if you have it." The voice was clean, American, and terrifyingly loud in her earpiece. Elara groaned, rolling onto her left side. She couldn't stay here. The bird wasn't going to hover over a cliff ledge. She had to get down to the wadi. She had to get to the team. She grabbed the drag handle of the TAC-50 with her good hand. The rifle was scarred, the finish scraped down to bare metal, the scope held together by duct tape and hope. It was ugly. It was beautiful. Moving. She whispered to no one. The descent was a blur of agony. Every step sent a shockwave through her dislocated shoulder. She slid more than she walked, riding the loose shale down the ravine, tearing her uniform, shredding the skin on her left palm. She didn't feel the cold anymore. She was operating on the fumes of survival instinct. When she hit the valley floor, the dust was still hanging in the air, a thick, choking fog of pulverized rock and cordite. The crater from the J Dam was a black wound in the earth, 50 meters wide, still radiating heat. She stumbled toward the wadi. Figures emerged from the haze. They looked like statues made of ash. The SEALs of Team Echo were unrecognizable. Their multicam uniforms were black with soot and blood. Their eyes were white circles in blackened faces. "Hold fire," a voice croaked. It was Tex. He stepped out of the ditch, his weapon lowered. He walked toward her, limping heavily. He stopped 3 feet away. Elara tried to stand at attention, but her knees buckled. She swayed, using the rifle as a crutch. I'm here," she slurred. "I'm RTB." Tex didn't say anything. He looked at the blood drying on her face. He looked at the makeshift sling holding her arm. He looked at the duct-taped scope on the massive rifle she refused to let go of. He reached out and gently took the rifle from her hand. "I got it," he said softly. "I got the weight, Elara." He didn't call her Vance. He didn't call her Kid. He used her name. "Chief?" she asked, looking past him. "Alive. Barely." Tex turned and signaled the others. 2 operators were carrying a litter, a collapsible stretcher. Master Chief Miller lay on it, wrapped in space blankets, an IV bag held high by the medic, who was stumbling alongside. The sound of the Chinook became a roar. The massive dark shape of the helicopter crested the ridgeline, blocking out the stars. The downwash hit them like a physical blow, kicking up a fresh storm of sand. "Go! Move! Move!" The crew chief screamed from the ramp, waving glow sticks. It wasn't a tactical withdrawal. It was a desperate scramble. The SEALs, the elite warriors of the Navy, were dragging themselves into the belly of the beast. Tex grabbed Elara by her combat harness. "Come on! Don't quit on me now!" He hauled her up the ramp. The metal deck was slippery with hydraulic fluid. The heat from the engines was overwhelming. Elara collapsed onto the web seating, sliding down until she hit the floor. She couldn't sit up. She curled into a ball, clutching her knees with her good arm. The ramp hissed shut. The engines whined as the pilot pulled power, lifting the heavy bird into the sky. The vibration changed. They were airborne. They were safe. The interior of the Chinook was bathed in the red glow of the tactical lights. It was a hellscape of exhausted men. Elara looked across the aisle. The medic was working on Miller, checking the tourniquets, pushing fluids. Miller's face was gray, his eyes closed. Next to him sat Breaker, his leg bandaged, his head hanging low. And then there was Tex. He sat directly across from her. He had the TAC-50 between his knees. He was running his hand over the duct tape on the scope, tracing the fracture in the glass. He looked up and met her eyes. He tapped his chest, right over his heart, and nodded. A slow, solemn nod. The other SEALs saw it. They looked at her. The skepticism, the mockery, the arrogance of the briefing room, it was all gone. In its place was something heavier. It was the look men give to someone who has walked through the fire and come out the other side carrying their lives in her hands. They didn't high-five. They didn't cheer. They just stared at the 19-year-old girl who had broken the laws of physics to keep them breathing. Elara wanted to say something. She wanted to ask if she did well. She wanted to ask if she would be court-martialed for the laser strike. But she couldn't speak. The adrenaline crash hit her like a sledgehammer. The pain in her shoulder came rushing back, screaming for attention. She leaned her head back against the vibrating fuselage. A single tear leaked out, cutting a clean line through the grime on her cheek. She wasn't a girl anymore. She wasn't even a soldier. She was something else. She was the silence that comes after the thunder. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 48 hours, she let the darkness take her completely. The room was white. Not the dusty brown white of the Afghan mountains, but a chemical, sterile white that hurt the eyes. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with the sound of angry insects, a low-frequency hum that seemed to drill into Elara's skull. She sat on a metal folding chair, her right arm encased in a heavy black sling. She was wearing her clean utility uniform, the fabric stiff and smelling of industrial laundry detergent. It felt alien against her skin. Across the table sat Commander Sterling. He was a man who fought wars with PowerPoint slides and budget approvals. His uniform was impeccable, his fingernails clean. He smelled of coffee and expensive aftershave. On the table between them lay a thick file folder. It was stamped with red ink, top secret, no foreign. "Corporal Vance," Sterling said, tapping a pen against the file. "We have reviewed the helmet cam footage from Team Echo. We have reviewed the flight logs from the F-16 sortie. And we have the initial statements from Master Chief Miller." Elara said nothing. She stared at the wall behind him. Her concussion had faded to a dull headache. But the noise of the valley, the thump of the mortars, the crack of her rifle, was still louder than the buzzing lights. "It is an impressive account," Sterling continued, choosing his words carefully. "However, there are complications." The door opened. The whine of an electric wheelchair announced the arrival of Master Chief Miller. He looked smaller than he had in the mountains. He was pale, a thick bandage wrapped around his neck where the shrapnel had nicked the artery. His leg was casted, but his eyes were the same, hard blue flint. "Don't sign it, Vance," Miller rasped. His voice was a wreck, damaged by the injury. "Don't you sign a damn thing until they put the commendation in writing." Sterling sighed, looking at Miller with the patience one reserves for a difficult child. "Master Chief, we have discussed this. The optics are problematic." "Optics?" Miller spat the word. "She saved the entire platoon. She killed a sniper at 1,200 meters. She stopped a technical at 2,400. That's a record. That is a Navy Cross, minimum." "It is a political nightmare," Sterling corrected, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We cannot have a press release stating that a Tier 1 SEAL element was pinned down and rescued by a 19-year-old female support attachment. It undermines the deterrence value of the unit. It embarrasses the department." Elara looked at the file. She looked at the typed report upside down. "Target neutralization. Credited to Echo Element, Collective. Vehicle destruction. Credited to Air Support, GBU-38. Sniper elimination, unconfirmed." They were erasing her. Not out of malice, but out of bureaucratic necessity. The legend of the SEALs had to be maintained. They were the invincible demigods. They couldn't be saved by a girl from Appalachia with a duct-taped rifle. "This is horse shit," Miller growled, trying to wheel himself closer to the table. "I will go to the Admiral. I will testify." "And if you do," Sterling said coldly, "the investigation into the Broken Arrow call will be reopened. You called in Ordnance Danger Close. You violated 3 different ROEs. If we scrutinize this, Master Chief, your pension is gone, and Corporal Vance faces a court-martial for unauthorized use of a laser designator." The room went silent. The threat was naked and absolute. Miller froze. He looked at Elara, his expression crumbling. He had been ready to sacrifice his career for her, but Sterling had just put her career on the chopping block too. Elara stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. She walked to the table. She picked up the pen. "Vance," Miller whispered, "you don't have to do this." Elara looked at him. For the first time since the extraction, she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the tired, knowing smile of a veteran. "It doesn't matter, Chief," she said softly. "It matters to me," Miller said. "I know what I did. Elara said. She looked down at the paper. And you know, and the guys know. That's enough. She signed her name at the bottom of the NDA. The signature was clean, steady. Elara J. Vance, CPL. She closed the folder. Am I dismissed, Commander? She asked Sterling. Sterling looked surprised, then relieved. He took the folder, sliding it into his briefcase. Yes, Corporal. You are reassigned to Bagram Support Battalion effective immediately, pending rotation back to the States. No, Elara said. Sterling paused. Excuse me? I don't want to go back to the States, Elara said. I want to stay in theater. Put me on the roster for the next rotation. Vance, Miller said, shaking his head. Go home. Go to college. Get away from this. Elara looked at her reflection in the darkened window of the briefing room. She saw the girl who had arrived a week ago, nervous, eager to please. That girl was gone. She had died on the cliff ledge. The person looking back was calm, dangerous, silent. I'm good at this, Elara said simply, and the mountains are quiet. She turned and walked to the door. She didn't salute the commander. She stopped by Miller's wheelchair. She reached out with her good hand and touched his shoulder. See you around, Grave, she whispered, using his call sign for the first time. Miller looked up at her, tears standing in his eyes. He nodded once, a salute given without a hand raised. Elara walked out of the room. She stepped into the hallway and pushed through the heavy double doors, stepping out into the Afghan night. The air smelled of diesel and dust, the same smell as the valley. The runway lights stretched out into the darkness, two parallel lines leading to nowhere. Somewhere out there in the dark, there were bad men doing bad things, and somewhere, someone needed a ghost to watch over them. She wasn't a hero. Heroes got medals. Heroes got parades. She was a needle, sharp, invisible, and necessary. She adjusted her sling, took a deep breath of the cold air, and began to walk toward the armory.